Hello. Thank you for viewing this video from the Center for Inclusive Excellence on Equity-Minded Faculty Evaluation. My name is Nora Schultz, and this is the second of 3 videos on this topic. In the first segment, Lot Hill provided an overview of where and how bias shows up in the faculty evaluation process. In this second video, I will review the faculty evaluation process at SDSU, and then in the third segment, the two of us will share takeaways on how to prepare for and mitigate the potential for bias in the evaluation process. So what does our policy actually say? And remember, this workshop is not about changing our policy, it's about how we evaluate using the policies that we have. When we get to a few more slides, you'll see some changes that were made a few years ago that highlight DEIB issues. But again, how a review evaluates is a somewhat different matter. So here's our policy, and we want to remember that we are looking at effectiveness of teaching, professional growth, and service to the university profession and the community. And we're looking at the high standards of professional conduct. And we also want to remember that student evaluations shall be important in evaluating instruction, but not the sole indicator. So, where and how might reviewer bias show up? Well, actually, in all 3 of these areas: teaching, research, scholarship, and creative work, and indeed service to the university. Some safeguards are already in place in our current system. Those of you who are on RTP committees are familiar with the slide deck that is to be reviewed each year. One of the points that is emphasized very early on is that one of our mutual obligations as faculty is limiting evaluation criteria to those ratified and published in university, college, and department school policies. We do not use undocumented metrics. We don't go by folklore. We use evidence to make these evaluations, but we have to consider what evidence. For example, some criteria are still subjective, even if it's evidence. And even if committees can agree on norms, it may be unclear how to use evidence like teaching materials to show whether or not criteria have been met. Fortunately, all of the established criteria are supported by a large body of research on effective teaching and learning that has identified certain observable behaviors and characteristics that reviewers can look for in candidates' materials. This is mentioned with citations in the slide deck from Faculty Affairs. What you need to think about when you look at our RTP guidelines is how they intersect with the guiding principles that Lott reviewed. So let's start thinking about teaching and our primary source of data, which is generally the student course evaluations. Keep in mind that extensive research has indicated various problems inherent in student course evaluation tools, and that bias often influences student assessment of teaching. Some faculty have even suggested de-emphasizing student evaluations of teaching in the faculty review process, and we strongly recommend that prior to and during the review of materials, committee members discuss the potential for bias and agree on how they will mitigate the potential for inequity that could result from the bias that is likely to be present in student course evaluations. What you can think about are approaches that may mitigate the potential for reviewer bias in each of these areas, such as understanding multiple types of inquiry, understanding the research about the relationship between student identity and faculty identity, and how that may play out in evaluations. You are not changing what we are evaluating. You are educating yourself so that you can evaluate without bias, or perhaps by understanding, particularly in student evaluations, the bias that might underlie some of the data. Also, if we don't have trained peers, this can create bias in the peer evaluations. And we do have a solution to that as well that I will come to at the very end of this segment. So let's think about other concerns. Think about research. Think about newer journals, people with which people might not be familiar in newer areas. Type of research. There's multiple types of research, and we know that different ways of inquiry. Sometimes it's not good to rely on impact scores. We know that we feel that that's sort of a way of verifying the breadth of somebody's impact, but that might not always be in certain areas the best way to assess someone. This relates to agency and representation and flexibility, some of the principles that Lot mentioned. From the aforementioned slide deck from Faculty Affairs, and in alignment with this, academic units should review their RTP criteria to ensure that community engaged scholarship, when appropriate to the discipline, is valued as professional growth. Again, in alignment with policy statements or recommendations from relevant disciplinary and professional organizations. So we can think about our processes in regard to these principles also in regard to levels of review. We've been talking about our university policies, which allow for flexibility, but does a particular colleges? Does the departments? It's important to have college and departmental based criteria due to the nature of disciplinary difference, but then that impacts context and also consistency. One thing that can help balance this is that SDSU provides yearly training for all committee members across all levels of review. And lastly, there's considerable evidence about the unfair burden placed on or accepted by, due to social roles, women or BIPOC faculty in regard to service. And service, while clearly a criteria, is not given the same weight in these decisions as teaching and research, particularly at a research institution such as ours. And this issue intersects with credit, one of the principles that Locke discussed. I want to go back and highlight something that I talked about in the beginning. If you'll note these parts in red, and you should go and look at this after you finish the workshop. This is where we've clarified in the policies the relationship of DEIB issues to our actual reviews and how it fits now that we have college departmental diversity plans and exactly how candidates should address DEIB and their research and their teaching and their service so that it's no longer a question about where that fits in the narrative and so forth and how a candidate should be reviewed in regard to DEIB. And it's not a change in policy, it's just a clarification. And so the three sections are here, both for faculty, for library faculty, and for student affairs faculty. And then two final notes. One, and this has come up a bit, currently, the course average GPAs are not available for the dossiers. That column is no longer included in the one table. It's being discussed as a possible change, but would not impact the 24-25 cycle. And much more important is the addition of peer observation. While not required, it's strongly encouraged for departments to consider. And if you actually already do peer evaluation, it would really be good to consider using what's being set up because there's training and so forth, and that can really eliminate the bias. And so it would be greatly to your great advantage to use the training that's available for the peer observation. And if you don't use it, it would be something that should be considered strongly. And with that, then it concludes part 2 of our three-part series. Please watch part 3, where we offer takeaways on how to mitigate the potential for bias in the faculty evaluation process. Thanks so much.